Roumie was about to utter 7 words that would alter Jasmine Crockett's life forever, but neither of them saw it coming. She had just launched what she thought was the perfect strike, a question sharp as a blade, designed to dismantle the man who plays Jesus on television. The cameras were rolling, 12 million viewers were glued to their screens, and Jasmine, with a confident smile, believed she had him cornered. But Jonathan's response would stun everyone in that studio. What were those 7 words that stopped Jasmine in her tracks? What could the man who portrays Christ possibly say that 3 major networks would later try to bury? This is the story of the most explosive interview in television history, where unyielding faith collided with a million-dollar empire. And it all began when Jasmine made a fatal mistake, challenging the wrong person on the wrong day. 3 weeks earlier, Jonathan Roumie sat in his modest Chicago apartment, quietly reading his morning prayers. The room told the story of his life, bare walls, adorned only with a wooden crucifix carved by his Lebanese grandmother. A faded photo of his father, who died believing his son would never amount to anything. In stacks of theology books, their pages worn from years of study. His kitchen table was covered with letters from viewers of the chosen people, thanking him for showing them what authentic faith looks like in a world full of spiritual counterfeits. Jonathan had never chased fame, never sought fortune, and had turned down countless opportunities to profit from his role as Jesus. But that morning, a phone call changed everything. The voice on the other end belonged to the head producer of Jasmine's Light, the wildly popular talk show hosted by Jasmine Crockett. They offered him a spot on a spiritual enlightenment special featuring various faith leaders and spiritual teachers. Jonathan knew about Jasmine. She wasn't just a rising political star. She was a media powerhouse who had turned spirituality into a lucrative brand. Her Radiant Soul courses cost $2,000 a head, promising to unlock divine energy through meditation and positive thinking. Her books, seminars, and partnerships with New Age gurus had built an empire worth hundreds of millions, all based on the idea that spirituality was something you could buy and control. Jonathan hesitated. He nearly declined. But something in his spirit whispered this was where God wanted him to be. He glanced around his apartment where simplicity reigned. A 15-year-old Honda sat in the parking lot. His bank account rarely held more than a few $1,000s. But he didn't need more. His faith lived in the crucifix on the wall, in the letters from viewers, and in his personal relationship with God. Jasmine's invitation wasn't just an opportunity, it was a test. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he also believed that sometimes God calls his people to be lights in the darkness, even at great cost. Jonathan began preparing. He researched Jasmine's spiritual ventures, the pricey courses, the promises of wealth and happiness, the beautifully packaged but hollow products. His heart ached for the millions drawn in by those promises, spending thousands to find hope, but receiving only empty formulas. He knew he couldn't stay silent. If he went on air, he would speak the truth, even if it cost him everything: his career, his reputation, or any future TV appearances. The night before the taping, Jonathan knelt on his apartment floor, praying for wisdom, courage, and the grace to speak truth with love. He thought of Jesus overturning the tables in the temple, driving out those who turned his father's house into a marketplace. He remembered the woman at the well, the tax collector, the thief on the cross, broken people who found true hope through a relationship with God, not through costly courses or secret formulas. Jonathan made peace with the possibility that this appearance might end his career, but he told himself some truths are worth telling, no matter the consequences. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at the Jasmine's Light studio in downtown Chicago. The opulence hit him immediately: gleaming marble floors, sparkling crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with photos of Jasmine, alongside celebrities and world leaders. The green room buzzed with other guests, spiritual teachers, self-help authors, each promoting their latest book or course, discussing million-dollar publishing deals and marketing strategies. Jonathan sat quietly in a corner, holding his worn copy of the Gospel of Luke, his eyes distant. The contrast was stark. They were here to sell spirituality. He was here to share faith. A production assistant approached with a clipboard outlining Jasmine's questions and coaching him on promoting his brand. "Make sure you plug any books, courses, or merchandise you're selling," she said with practiced efficiency. "Jasmine's audience loves spiritual content, and this is your chance to cash in." Jonathan smiled politely and declined to review the talking points. "I'm not here to sell anything," he said. The assistant looked baffled, as if she'd never met someone uninterested in profiting from their spiritual platform. As the other guests took the stage, Jonathan watched from the wings as Jasmine interviewed a series of spiritual entrepreneurs. Each segment was a polished sales pitch, with Jasmine skillfully steering the conversation toward products and programs her audience could buy. The crowd clapped enthusiastically, clearly hungry for hope and meaning, but being offered costly substitutes instead of real transformation. Jonathan felt the weight of what he was about to face. His message of free grace and a genuine relationship with God would be jarring in this setting. When his turn came, Jonathan walked onto the stage wearing his father's old navy blazer, carrying only his Bible. No promotional materials, no business cards, no agenda, but to speak truth. Jasmine greeted him with her signature warmth, but Jonathan saw the calculation in her eyes. The audience applauded politely, yet the air in the studio shifted as if they sensed something different about this guest. Jonathan took his seat, silently praying for words that would honor God and reach the hearts of these people searching for something real. The battle was about to begin, and he knew one wrong move could cost him everything. Jonathan Roumie sat under the bright studio lights, his Bible resting on his lap, as Jasmine Crockett leaned forward with her trademark charisma. The audience of Jasmine's light buzzed with anticipation, sensing the shift in the air. Jasmine had built her empire on guiding millions toward what she called universal enlightenment. But Jonathan was here with a different message, one that could unravel everything she stood for. The camera zoomed in, capturing every glance, every gesture. Jasmine thought she held the upper hand, but she was about to discover that truth doesn't bend to charm or power. What began as a routine interview was turning into a battle of worldviews, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Jasmine opened with her usual flair, her voice smooth and inviting. "Jonathan, you've touched millions with your portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen," she said, her smile radiating warmth. "Tell us about the spiritual practices that have elevated you to this level of influence." The question was carefully crafted, laced with the language of New Age spirituality, vague enough to fit her audience's expectations, broad enough to keep Jonathan in her narrative. She expected him to play along, to offer some palatable insight about meditation or mindfulness that she could spin into her brand. But Jonathan saw the trap. He paused, his eyes steady, recognizing the attempt to frame his faith in her terms. This was his first test, conform to her language, or risk alienating her audience with the truth. "Jasmine, I appreciate the question, but I think there's a misunderstanding," he said gently, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to talk about spiritual practices or levels of influence. I'm here because of Jesus Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the studio. Jasmine's smile tightened, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. The audience shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, others exchanging uneasy glances. This wasn't the inclusive, feel-good spirituality they were used to. Jonathan continued, his tone unwavering. "Everything I do comes from my relationship with the living God, not from techniques I've mastered or insights I've unlocked." The room grew quieter, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Jasmine, a master of media, recovered quickly, her training kicking in. She tilted her head, her voice still warm, but now with a hint of challenge. "That's beautiful, Jonathan," she said. "And of course there are many paths to the divine, many ways to connect with that universal energy you call Jesus." Her words were deliberate, designed to dilute his claim, to make his faith just one option in her spiritual marketplace. But Jonathan had spent years studying theology, and he recognized her tactic. He knew this moment would define the rest of the interview. "Actually, Jasmine, I have to respectfully disagree," he said, his voice steady but kind. "Jesus said, 'I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.' That's not one path among many. That's the only path." The audience fell silent, the air thick with tension. Jasmine's expression hardened, her warmth giving way to something sharper. She had built her career on the idea that all spiritual paths led to the same destination, and Jonathan had just challenged the core of her empire. The crowd sensed the shift, their polite applause replaced by a nervous hush. Jasmine leaned back, her eyes narrowing slightly. Jonathan, surely you don't mean to suggest that billions of good spiritual people around the world are wrong about their beliefs. She said, her tone controlled but edged with accusation. Isn't that kind of exclusive thinking exactly what's wrong with organized religion? The question was a loaded weapon meant to paint Jonathan as judgmental, to make him squirm under the weight of her audience's disapproval. But Jonathan had faced this challenge before, and he knew the difference between speaking truth and being cruel. He leaned forward, his voice filled with compassion. Jasmine, I'd never call anyone a bad person because of their beliefs, he said, his eyes meeting hers. But truth isn't determined by sincerity or good intentions. It's determined by reality. He paused, turning to the audience, his expression gentle, almost as if he were portraying Jesus himself. If my house is on fire and someone sincerely believes water won't put it out, their sincerity doesn't change the fact that I need water to save my home. The analogy was simple, yet it cut through the room like a blade. Some audience members nodded, their faces softening, while others crossed their arms, unsure how to process the shift. Jasmine's composure wavered, her frustration bubbling beneath her polished exterior. She wasn't used to guests who refused to play her game. But Jonathan? She pressed, her voice taking on a patronizing edge. Don't you think it's arrogant to claim your religion is the only true one? What about all the wisdom traditions that have guided people for thousands of years? The audience murmured in agreement, some nodding, clearly uncomfortable with Jonathan's exclusivity. Jasmine's question was meant to corner him, to make him seem narrow-minded in front of her diverse, open-minded viewers. Jonathan had been preparing for this moment his entire life, even if he didn't know it. Jasmine, I'm not claiming my religion is true, he said, his voice growing stronger, more resolute. I'm claiming Jesus Christ is true. There's a difference. Religion can become just another product to sell another way, to make people feel good without changing their hearts. The words hit like a thunderclap, and Jasmine's eyes narrowed further. She knew he was speaking about her empire, the courses, the books, the seminars that promised enlightenment for a price. The audience sat frozen, hanging on every word as the interview turned into a theological showdown. Jonathan sensed he was crossing a line, but he couldn't stop now. The Jesus I follow didn't come to start a religion or build an empire, he said, his voice alive with quiet passion. He came to seek and save the lost, to offer forgiveness to sinners, to give hope to the hopeless. And he did it all for free. No courses, no levels, no secret knowledge only the enlightened can access. The words hung in the air, a direct challenge to everything Jasmine had built. She sat rigid, her public persona clashing with the private anger flashing in her eyes. The cameras caught every moment, her carefully crafted image beginning to crack. Jasmine decided to strike back, her instincts as a media titan taking over. She leaned forward, her voice sharp. Jonathan, let's be real for a moment, she said, her tone dripping with accusation. You've made millions playing Jesus on a hit show. Isn't it a bit hypocritical to criticize others for monetizing spirituality when you've built your career on it? The attack was personal, designed to expose him as a fraud and reclaim control of the narrative. The audience perked up, sensing a shift, some whispering to each other, waiting for Jonathan to falter. But Jasmine had miscalculated. She didn't know the truth about Jonathan's life. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper worn from handling. Jasmine, you're right to ask that, he said calmly, holding up the paper toward the camera. This is my bank statement from last month. My balance is $1.847. I give away everything except what I need to survive. The audience gasped, a collective shock rippling through the studio. Jasmine's face paled, her confidence shaken. This wasn't in her research, wasn't part of the narrative she'd prepared to dismantle him. Jonathan continued, his voice steady but earnest. I live in the same apartment I've had for 8 years, drive a 15-year-old Honda, and eat most of my meals at home, because that's all I can afford. The revelation sent shockwaves through the room, the contrast between his humility and Jasmine's opulent empire stark and undeniable. When Jesus called his disciples, he told them to take nothing for the journey, no money, no extra clothes, no security. He said anyone who wants to follow him must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow. That doesn't mean everyone has to be poor, but it does mean our treasure should be in heaven, not in building earthly empires. The words struck Jasmine like a physical blow. each one exposing the chasm between her prosperity-driven spirituality and the radical teachings of Christ. The audience sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Jonathan's quiet conviction and Jasmine's tightening jaw. The interview was no longer a talk show segment, it was a reckoning. And as the tension in the studio reached a breaking point, Jonathan prepared to share a story that would change everything, a story that would bring the weight of truth crashing down on Jasmine's carefully constructed world. The studio of Jasmine's light was a pressure cooker, the air thick with unspoken questions. Jonathan Roumie sat calmly, his Bible still in hand, while Jasmine Crockett gripped the arms of her chair, her polished smile now a thin mask. The audience, once eager for spiritual soundbites, sat riveted, sensing they were witnessing something far beyond a talk show. Jonathan's words had already shaken the foundation of Jasmine's empire, exposing the emptiness of her costly spiritual promises. But Jasmine wasn't ready to surrender. She was a fighter, a media titan who'd built her career on controlling narratives. She leaned forward, ready to strike again, determined to regain the upper hand. What she didn't know was that Jonathan was about to share a story that would shatter her defenses, a story that would leave her speechless and change the course of the interview forever. Jasmine's voice cut through the tension, sharp and laced with venom. "Jonathan, that's a nice story about sacrifice," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "But let's be honest. You're getting all the attention and adoration for playing the most famous figure in history. Don't lecture me about humility when you're literally making a living pretending to be God." The outburst was a desperate move, a predator lashing out to reclaim her territory. The audience gasped, some shifting uncomfortably, others leaning forward, sensing blood in the water. Jasmine's words were meant to wound, to paint Jonathan as a hypocrite, basking in the glow of his role. But she had no idea how wrong she was. Jonathan remained unruffled, his eyes steady as if he'd been expecting this attack. "Jasmine, I'm not pretending to be God," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "I'm portraying a man who claimed to be God and was willing to die for that claim. There's a difference." He paused, letting the words sink in, his gaze softening as he looked at the audience. "And the attention you mentioned? Most of it comes from people desperate for hope, for meaning, for someone to tell them they're loved unconditionally. The same people who watch your show looking for the same thing." The parallel was devastating, and Jasmine's eyes flickered with recognition. She had built her empire on that same hunger, offering expensive courses and books as substitutes for the love and grace Jonathan spoke of. The audience felt the shift, their murmurs fading into a heavy silence. Jasmine's composure was unraveling, her frustration now visible in the tightness of her jaw. She opened her mouth to respond, but Jonathan raised a hand, his voice gentle but firm. "Jasmine, let me tell you about someone who's watching your show right now," he said. "His name is Michael, and he's 7 years old." The room froze. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. Jonathan's voice softened, tinged with emotion. "3 days ago, I got a call from Michael's mother in Detroit. He's dying of leukemia, and he watches The Chosen every day in his hospital bed. It's the only thing that gives him peace." The audience was silent, some already blinking back tears. Jasmine sat rigid, her earlier confidence replaced by a growing unease. Jonathan continued, his voice steady but heavy. "His mother asked if I could talk to him just for a few minutes. So I did. Michael asked me if Jesus really loves little boys who are sick, if heaven is real, if his mommy and daddy will be okay when he's gone." Tears began to glisten in the eyes of audience members, and even the hardened stage crew looked shaken. Jonathan's gaze locked onto Jasmine, his expression both compassionate and unflinching. "I told him yes, Jesus loves him more than he can imagine, that heaven is more beautiful than any place he could dream of, that his parents will see him again someday." His voice broke slightly, but he pressed on. "Then Michael asked me something that broke my heart. He asked if the lady on TV who talks about God, you Jasmine, really knows Jesus, or if she's just pretending. Because he said you seem sad when you smile." The words hit Jasmine like a sledgehammer. Her face drained of color, her hands trembling in her lap. A 7-year-old boy facing death had seen through her carefully crafted persona with a clarity only a child could possess. The audience began to murmur, some wiping tears, others staring at Jasmine with new eyes. For the first time in her career, she was speechless, her empire of confidence crumbling under the weight of a child's innocent question. Jonathan's voice grew quieter, almost a whisper. I told Michael that only God knows what's in someone's heart, but that he should pray for everyone who talks about God on TV. Because it's a big responsibility. The simplicity of the story was shattering. It wasn't an attack, but a mirror reflecting the difference between authentic faith and the polished performance Jasmine had mastered. She tried to respond, her voice shaky. That's emotional manipulation, she stammered, but the words lacked conviction. She looked at the audience expecting support, but saw something new in their faces, disappointment, even pity. They were seeing her as Michael had, someone who seemed sad beneath the smile, someone offering hope while wrestling with her own emptiness. Jonathan shook his head, his expression sorrowful but resolute. No, Jasmine, it's just a little boy who knows the difference between someone who loves Jesus and someone who uses Jesus, he said. Children see things adults miss because their hearts aren't clouded by pride or ambition. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras felt deafening. Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up for Jasmine to see. Michael's watching this show right now from his hospital bed. His mother texted me this morning to say he was excited to see Jesus on TV with the lady who helps people. He paused, his voice steady but piercing. Would you like me to call him Jasmine? So you can tell him yourself that his faith is just wishful thinking, that Jesus is just one path among many, and his hope might be misplaced. The challenge hung in the air like a sword, sharp and unyielding. Jasmine's face went white, her breath catching in her throat. The audience watched, some with horror, others with expectation, as the reality of the moment sank in. Here was a dying child clinging to faith, and Jasmine had spent the last half hour trying to undermine the very foundation of that hope. I can't, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The admission was a crack in her armor, a moment of raw vulnerability from a woman who had built her life on being unbreakable. The audience stirred, some crying openly, others clutching their hands together as if in prayer. Jonathan's expression softened, his voice, now filled with the compassion of someone who understood both the weight of truth and the pain of facing it. Jasmine. I don't think you want to hurt Michael or anyone else, he said gently. I think you genuinely want to help people find hope and meaning. But somewhere along the way, I think you started believing you could improve on what Jesus offered, that you could package it better, make it more appealing, more profitable. The words were like a scalpel cutting through years of rationalization. Jasmine sat frozen, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Jonathan continued, his voice steady but urgent. The problem is, when you try to improve on perfection, you end up with something less. When you try to make the gospel palatable to everyone, you end up with something that saves no one. Each word was a blow to the foundation of Jasmine's empire, and the audience felt it too. Many had spent years chasing her promises of enlightenment, only to realize they'd been running after shadows. Jonathan turned to the crowd, his voice softening. You don't need to buy truth, he said. You don't need to earn love. Jesus offers all of it freely to anyone who comes to him with empty hands and an open heart. The words were a lifeline, and the audience clung to them, some nodding through tears, others staring at Jasmine as if seeing her for the first time. The interview had become something sacred, a moment where pretense was stripped away and truth stood bare. Jasmine's hands shook as she gripped her chair, her voice barely a whisper. But what about all the people I've helped? She asked, her tone desperate, almost pleading. What about the lives I've changed? It was the cry of someone whose identity was crumbling. Jonathan's eyes softened further, his voice tender. Jasmine, kindness is always good. Encouragement is valuable. But helping people feel better about their lives isn't the same as helping them find eternal purpose. The question isn't whether you've done good things, it's whether you've pointed people to the one who is good. The studio was a sea of emotion, the audience hanging on every word, some whispering prayers, others wiping tears. Jasmine sat silent, her empire exposed, her heart laid bare. And as the cameras rolled, capturing every second of her unraveling, Jonathan prepared to offer her something she'd never expected, a chance at grace that could change everything. The studio of Jasmine's light was no longer a stage for polished performances. It had become a sacred space where truth and vulnerability collided. Jonathan Roumie sat with quiet resolve, his Bible still in his lap, his eyes filled with compassion. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett was a shadow of her usual self, her hands trembling, her once confident demeanor shattered by the story of Michael, the 7-year-old boy, whose innocent question had pierced her heart. The audience, 12 million viewers, strong, watched in stunned silence, their tears reflecting the weight of the moment. Jasmine had built an empire on spiritual promises, but Jonathan's words had exposed their emptiness, leaving her grappling with a question she'd never faced. What if she'd been wrong all along? As the cameras rolled, the world held its breath, waiting to see what the queen of media would do next. Jasmine's voice, when it finally came, was barely audible, a fragile whisper that carried the weight of decades. "What if you're right?" she asked, her eyes locked on Jonathan, raw and searching. "What if I've been wrong about everything?" The vulnerability in her words was seismic, a crack in the foundation of a woman who had spent years positioning herself as the source of hope and wisdom. The audience leaned forward, some clutching tissues, others clasping their hands in silent prayer. This was Jasmine Crockett, the unshakable media mogul, admitting the possibility that her entire life's work might have been built on sand. It was a moment unlike any in television history. Jonathan's response was immediate, his voice warm with hope. Then the same grace that saved a broken actor from New York can save a media titan from Chicago, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. The same Jesus who forgave the woman at the well can forgive anyone who comes to him honestly. He leaned forward, his tone gentle but certain. "Jasmine, the beautiful thing about Jesus is that he doesn't ask you to have it all figured out. He meets you right where you are, takes all your brokenness and mistakes, and makes something beautiful out of them." The offer of grace hung in the air like a lifeline, and the audience felt its power, some nodding through tears, others whispering amen under their breath. Jasmine's face crumpled, her carefully maintained facade dissolving. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and then in a moment that would be replayed millions of times, she walked across the stage and knelt beside Jonathan. Tears streamed down her face, her shoulders shaking as years of pride and self-reliance fell away. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, her voice raw with honesty. "I don't know how to stop being in control." The admission was staggering, a public unraveling of a woman who had built her life on being the one with all the answers. The audience watched, some sobbing openly, as their larger-than-life host revealed herself to be as broken and needy as they were. Jonathan knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That's exactly where Jesus wants you to be," he said softly. "At the end of yourself with nowhere else to turn. That's where all of us have to start." He looked out at the audience, his voice steady but filled with tenderness. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." He was talking about people who know they have nothing to offer God except their need. The words were revolutionary in this temple of self-empowerment, where Jasmine's courses had promised abundance through effort and enlightenment through payment. Now the idea that weakness could be strength, that spiritual poverty could lead to riches, struck like lightning. "Jasmine," Jonathan continued, his voice soft but piercing, "would you like me to pray with you?" The question was simple, yet it carried the weight of eternity. The surrender of control, the acknowledgement of need, the first step toward a real relationship with God. Jasmine nodded, unable to speak, her tears falling freely. Jonathan bowed his head, and something extraordinary happened. The pretense that had defined Jasmine's light melted away. The performance ended, and for the first time in the show's history, authentic worship began to fill the space. Jesus, Jonathan prayed, his voice clear and unadorned. "Here is your daughter Jasmine. She's tired of trying to be strong enough, smart enough, successful enough. She wants to know you, not just know about you." The prayer was simple, free of the flowery language or manipulative flair often seen on televised spirituality. As Jonathan prayed, Jasmine's sobs grew deeper, not the controlled tears of a performer, but the raw, unguarded grief of someone whose heart was breaking open. She was mourning the years spent building walls instead of bridges, to God selling spiritual products instead of sharing spiritual truth. The audience was transfixed, many joining in silent prayer, their own hearts stirred by the scene unfolding before them. Camera operators hardened by years in the industry wiped their eyes caught up in the raw authenticity of the moment. Jasmine's empire, built on the promise of self-made enlightenment, was crumbling, and in its place, something real was taking root. When the prayer ended, Jasmine remained on her knees, her face buried in her hands as if afraid to face the reality of the world she'd created. Finally, she looked up at Jonathan, her eyes red, but holding something new, humility fragile but genuine. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small, uncertain. Jonathan smiled, his expression radiating the gentleness of someone who had walked this path from pride to grace. "Now you learn to walk with Jesus instead of trying to improve on him," he said. "Now you discover that being his daughter is better than being your own God." The words were a balm, and Jasmine's face softened, the hardness that had defined her melting away. The transformation was visible, a woman stepping out of the shadow of her empire into the light of something greater. As the show drew to a close, there was no upbeat music, no dancing, no manufactured celebration, just a quiet awe, like the hush after a storm. Jasmine stood, her legs still shaky, and faced her audience with new eyes. She saw them not as consumers of her spiritual brand, but as fellow travelers, each as broken and in need of grace as she was. "I don't know what this means for the show, for my business, for anything," she said, her voice trembling but honest. "But I know I can't go back to pretending I have all the answers when I've just realized I've been asking the wrong questions." The audience responded with gentle applause, not the raucous cheers of entertainment, but the respectful acknowledgement of courage. They had come expecting inspiration, but witnessed something far greater, a soul laid bare, a heart turning toward truth. Jasmine's words were a confession, a declaration that the empire she'd built was no longer enough. And as the cameras faded to black, the world knew they had seen something sacred, a moment when pride bowed to grace and a media mogul knelt before the king. But the story wasn't over. In the days and weeks that followed, Jasmine would make choices that would shock the world, choices that would cost her millions, but gain her something infinitely more valuable. And Jonathan, the man who had spoken truth without fear, would see the ripples of that day spread far beyond the studio, touching lives in ways no one could have imagined. The battle had been won, but the journey was just beginning. The lights of Jasmine's light had dimmed, but the impact of that unforgettable broadcast was just beginning to spread. Jonathan Roumie left the studio quietly, his Bible tucked under his arm, his heart full of gratitude for what had transpired. Jasmine Crockett, still shaken from her public surrender, stood alone on the stage, staring out at the empty seats where her audience had witnessed her unraveling. The cameras were off, but the world was still watching. The video of their exchange, raw and unfiltered, was already spreading across social media, racking up millions of views within hours. What happened in that Chicago studio wasn't just a moment, it was a movement, a testament to the power of authentic faith to transform even the most powerful hearts. And as the days turned to weeks, the ripple effects of that day would touch lives in ways no one could have predicted. In the immediate aftermath, Jasmine faced a reckoning. Her empire, built on $2,000 courses and promises of divine energy, was a house of cards that couldn't withstand the truth Jonathan had spoken. The next morning, she called a press conference, her face still carrying the softness of someone who had met grace. Standing before a sea of reporters, she announced a decision that stunned the entertainment world. She was ending her Radiant Soul courses and dismantling the commercial machinery of her spiritual brand. "I've been selling people what they wanted to hear instead of what they needed," she said, her voice steady but humble. "I've been pointing them to themselves when I should have been pointing them to their Savior." The financial cost was staggering. Hundreds of millions in revenue vanished overnight as partnerships dissolved and seminars were canceled. Social media erupted, some praising her courage, others mocking her as a fallen mogul. But Jasmine was undeterred. For the first time in decades, she felt a peace that no amount of wealth or fame could buy, a peace rooted in aligning her life with truth rather than profit. She sold her lavish Chicago penthouse and moved into a modest home, trading crystal chandeliers for simplicity. The woman who once defined success by her empire now measured it by her quiet moments of prayer, her growing relationship with the God she'd spent years repackaging. Jasmine's transformation wasn't without pain. She lost business allies who saw her shift as a betrayal, and fair-weather friends drifted away uninterested in a woman who no longer chased the spotlight. But she gained something far greater: authenticity. 6 months later, a small news story surfaced, overlooked by major outlets, but cherished by those who knew its significance. Jasmine had begun visiting children's hospitals not with cameras or press releases, but as a quiet servant. She sat with sick children and their families reading stories, holding hands and sharing the hope she'd found in Jesus. One of those children was Michael from Detroit, the boy whose question had sparked her awakening. Against all odds, Michael had lived longer than doctors predicted, and he beamed when he saw Jasmine telling nurses, "Miss Jasmine found Jesus too, just like me." Jonathan, meanwhile, returned to his work on The Chosen with a deeper sense of purpose. The viral video of the interview brought new attention to the show, but he remained unchanged, still living in his modest apartment, still driving his 15-year-old Honda. He read every letter from viewers, many of whom wrote that the exchange with Jasmine had inspired them to re-examine their own faith. One letter from a woman in Texas stood out. "I saw the most successful person I knew admit she needed a savior. If Jasmine Crockett can humble herself before Jesus, maybe I can too." Jonathan wept as he read it, marveling at how God had used a single moment to touch countless lives. The video itself became a cultural phenomenon, viewed over 500 million times, not for its sensationalism, but for its raw honesty. In an era of spiritual confusion and commercialized hope, people recognized truth when they saw it. Comments flooded in from around the world, stories of viewers who found courage to let go of pride, to seek Jesus, to admit their own need for grace. Pastors played clips in sermons, teachers used it in classrooms, and families watched it together, moved by the reminder that no one is too powerful or too lost to be transformed. The most poignant comment came from a young man in India. "I spent years chasing enlightenment. Jasmine's tears showed me I was looking in the wrong place. I found Jesus because of her." Jasmine and Jonathan stayed in touch, their unlikely friendship a testament to the God who bridges divides. Jasmine began attending a small church in Chicago, sitting in the back, listening intently to sermons that pointed her to Scripture rather than self. She started a new initiative, not for profit, but for purpose, offering free Bible studies to anyone seeking answers. When asked about her dramatic change, she would smile and say, "I thought I was successful when I had everything I wanted. I learned I was successful when I wanted what God wanted." The simplicity of her words belied the profound journey from self-worship to God worship, a journey that inspired millions. The ripple effects continued to spread. Jasmine's former fans, once drawn to her courses, began exploring Christianity, many finding churches where they encountered the gospel she now embraced. Some of her critics, who had scoffed at her spiritual venture, softened, moved by her humility and willingness to admit her mistakes. Even the media, initially skeptical, couldn't ignore the story's impact. A few outlets tried to spin it as a publicity stunt, but the authenticity of Jasmine's transformation was undeniable, silencing all but the most cynical. For Jonathan, the experience deepened his understanding of the grace he portrayed on screen. He continued to play Jesus with a quiet intensity, knowing that the role was more than acting. It was a calling to reflect Christ's love to a watching world. He never sought the spotlight, but when asked about that day in the studio, he would say God used a broken actor and a broken mogul to show the world that his grace is enough. That's the real story. The encounter between Jonathan and Jasmine became a watershed moment, not just for them, but for everyone who witnessed it. It was a reminder that truth spoken with love can pierce even the hardest hearts. It was proof that no empire, no matter how vast, can outshine the simplicity of the gospel. And it was a call to anyone watching to lay down pride, to seek the one who offers love without cost, to take the next step toward a God whose arms are always open. The story of that day continues to echo, changing lives in ways no expensive course ever could. Sometimes the greatest transformations happen not when we find all the answers, but when we admit we've been asking the wrong questions. For Jasmine, for Jonathan, and for millions around the world, the answer was clear: Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life. And for those still searching, the invitation remains: take the next step and discover the grace that's been waiting all along.